We're going to start off the second part of Chapter 14 by doing a quick review of the activities of the GI tract. Last video lecture we saw how that bolus is formed here in our mouth. We can then move that bolus from our mouth through our entire alimentary canal through this wave-like motion called propulsion. And so here we have ingestion, propulsion towards our pharynx, down our esophagus, through our stomach, into our small intestines, then our large intestines, and then finally out of the anus. We have lots of regions of mechanical digestion beginning here with the mouth. We have mastication. We also have mechanical digestion within the stomach, and of course here within our small intestines. Chemical breakdown, we have that starting with our mouth where we break down starch. Lots of protein digestion here within our stomach, and of course a substantial amount more of protein digestion, carbohydrates, and lipid absorption here within the small intestines. Absorption being that other function, and then finally anything that's solid waste is going to be removed from the body through the process of defecation. We have several organs contained in this alimentary canal that we just went over: the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, and then out of the anus. And remember, we have digestive accessory organs in which they're not part of this alimentary canal but assist in the process of digestion. We have the teeth, we have the pancreas, salivary glands, liver, and gallbladder. Let's finish off this chapter. So we just ended with looking at the overview of mechanical and chemical digestive activities. And so for the next few slides, here's an overview also of the different types of enzymes for carbohydrate, protein, and fat digestion, as well as where they occur. Okay, so once again, we have amylases. These are going to break down all of that starch. That's going to occur both within our oral cavity and then also within our small intestines, because we have that pancreatic amylase secreted by our pancreas. Small intestines also secrete other enzymes, so these ones you don't need to know as much, but basically they break down all these polysaccharides into monosaccharides. But these two you do want to know, so amylases for sure. All right, and once again, these are going to go through all the capillary bed and then go to the hepatic portal vein towards the liver. Our second category of food that we have are the protein digestion, and so this is going to break down of the polypeptides into amino acids. And so stomach, we started off with pepsin, so we had pepsinogen, you add hydrochloric acid to that, and now we form pepsin. Pancreatic enzymes, they have trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidases. And those are in your small intestines to break down the proteins. And then also we have brush border enzymes, so carboxypeptidases and dipeptidases. So pepsin, pepsinogen, hydrochloric acid, trypsin and chymotrypsin, those are the ones that you do want to know for your quiz. And what's interesting is that trypsin and chymotrypsin, these are actually isolated from certain animals to be used for research. So anytime, and usually like in the bench light setting, if you want to digest down your protein, they cleave between different types of amino acids, and by doing that you can isolate whatever protein you want. And so it's kind of interesting if you want to look at it for research purposes. Fat digestion, we use bile, and we also have pancreatic lipases. And remember, this one is different compared to your proteins and your carbohydrates because these enter the lacteals and are transported to our lymph in our thoracic duct. So these are completely different from our proteins and our carbohydrates. All right. Now, why do we even care about this food? And basically, really what we're doing is we're trying to feed ourselves. But really also what's contained in these foods are substances called nutrients. And so nutrition deals with looking at these nutrients and these substances and how it's used for the body to grow, repair itself, and also for proper body maintenance. And we can look at all the different categories of food through this very familiar structure called the pyramid, and usually you've seen it before where all of these were horizontal, and before you probably saw lots of grains on the bottom, and you have fruits and vegetables, and then you have your milk, your dairies, and then finally you have your meats, and then so on and so forth. But here now what has been changed in the past couple of years is this idea that, it's really more about a balanced diet. So you should have equal amounts of grains as vegetables and your fruits, your dairy, and your meats and your beans. And so in moderation with your meats and beans, and also your fats here in yellow. But really, everything should be more equal, which is why now we're going upwards towards the top. Okay, so major nutrients that we have within our body, we have those carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and water. Water not being so much like a nutrient, but it is needed. And then minor nutrients are our vitamins and our minerals. All of these are different types of carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are produced from plants. And so a lot of the grains that you eat, so a lot of the things that grow, those are all formed from our carbohydrates. And so carbohydrates are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the exception are lactose from milk and glycogens from meat. So those are the ones that are carbohydrates that are not derived from our plants. Now lipids, now what happens when you eat all those malasadas? You remember that from the very first day when we looked at adipocytes. So what happens is then you form fat cells. And so really you want to balance off the amount of lipids and fats you take into your body, because once again, if you're not going to use it, it gets stored. So we have two categories, and we saw this before. We had saturated and unsaturated fats. And really each of these squiggle lines at the top of them, so each of these pointy parts, that represents a carbon atom. And so really here this is saturated because all we have are these heavy carbon chains, and at the end of these carbon chains we have two hydrogen molecules. And because we have all these carbon-hydrogen chains, this is considered saturated. Unsaturated is when your carbon is bound to each other and you lose a hydrogen from each of these carbons. And so that forms an unsaturated. And so really, because we have this kink, if you recall me mentioning this a while back, this prevents the buildup or stacking of these molecules. And so because of that, you have a liquid at room temperature. Versus this, you notice it looks like nice, long, linear lines. Because of that, just think about all these stacked upon each other. And so at room temperature, we have a solid. So why is this good and why is this bad? Well, unsaturated fat, this is good because this actually increases good cholesterol. And good cholesterol, it kind of seems like an kind of strange, right? Because it's actually called high-density lipoproteins. And so these are needed for a couple of things. We need them for our cell. And so really, if we have these kinks within our cells, it allows things to pass in and out of our cells. Cholesterol we don't need to make our ATP, but we do need cholesterol to form our vitamins and our hormones, and once again, our plasma membrane. And saturated fats, these are bad because they increase our bad cholesterol, which we call LDL. Now, why is this also bad? So if you have lots of saturated fat, this increases low-density lipoproteins. And low-density lipoproteins, what these do is that they carry and store and bring all this fat towards our arteries and our vessels. And so really this kind of stacks up and builds upon our walls of our circulatory system, and that can give rise to atherosclerosis. And so which is why you want to limit your LDLs, but you want to increase your HDLs. Right, so it kind of sounds like, oh, kind of should be the opposite. Most of our cholesterol, though, is produced by our liver, which we're going to get into a little bit. But you also, of course, get it with your diet as well. Okay, another dietary source is going to be our proteins. There's different types of proteins that we have, and so really our body itself can produce proteins, but there are several types of proteins that we cannot produce itself. So because of that, we have to get this from our diet. So different fruits have different types of amino acids, and so by consuming different types of foods, we can really get all the 20 amino acids that we need in our body. Now, what about vegetarians? So how do vegetarians get their protein source? Well, they often turn to beans and bean derivatives, but these are actually incomplete. So what they need to do is have a very diversified diet. And so really, if you look at corns and grains, they have these 6 types of amino acids, which are essential that they cannot find within, that they typically would get in protein diets, such as your beef, your fishes, your poultry. But if you have a diet high in corn and other grains, what you're missing are these two critical amino acids, isoleucine and lysine. Now, if you have a diet where you eat lots of beans and other legumes, then you have these 6 amino acids, but you lack tryptophan and methionine. So really, if you are planning on being vegetarian, or if you are vegetarian, you really need to be mindful and balance your diet to get all those essential amino acids. And why is this critical? Well, once again, we need amino acids to build up our enzymes, to build up things for our cells, and also for our hormones. So there's just a couple of examples. So we need all these amino acids for different functions in our body. Now, what are enzymes? So enzymes, once again, these catalyze reactions. And in order for these to actually work, well, that's where vitamins come in. So vitamins, what these are coenzymes, meaning that here, this is called an apoenzyme, so this is an inactivated form. And this is produced by all those amino acids coming together, forming that tertiary and quaternary structure. But this is inactive, and so why do we need vitamins is because they serve as this coenzyme. When they come together with this protein of an enzyme, now we actually have a functioning enzyme. So when it's full, it's activated. And then finally we can break down and catalyze reactions. So where do we get these vitamin sources? Well, a lot of times from our fruits and vegetables, which is why we should be getting a good, well-balanced diet. So vitamin C, lots of that found within your oranges, folate, lots in your spinach. Vitamin B6 found within your red and green bell peppers. These are just some examples. But of course, we have lots of them in other different forms as well. So vitamins and other food groups. Now minerals, what are minerals? So minerals are needed because they play roles in the body. So if you think about potassium and we looked at sodium, you remember potassium and sodium, we needed these to help maintain our extracellular and intracellular environment, especially when we did those action potentials. So an example, potassium, which we give the letter K plus, and then also sodium, which we say Na plus. These were needed for those action potentials for two things, right? We needed action potentials for our nerve impulses, in our central nervous system, and we also needed that to initiate, also part of the central nervous system, initiate those muscle contractions. Alright, so these are just a couple of reminders of where these are actually important. Iron, where do we need iron? Well, if you recall our chapter 10 red blood cells, iron is needed to help bind to oxygen. Okay, so minerals play a critical part. Here are other examples you need it for your joint and bone health, hormone regulation, muscle function, nerve function. So really they play a large part of how our cell physiology works. Okay, so looking at all this food, once again, we need to break those different things down, those carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids down, so that we can build it up to something usable by our body. And so if you recall, this process is called metabolism, and the purpose then is to break it down, harness all that to form energy, but also to build up our cells. So breaking down, this is catabolism. So this is when substances are broken down to simpler and energy is released. Anabolism, and this is when larger molecules are built from smaller ones. Okay, so you can take something completely different, like a piece of chicken, break it down into amino acids, and then you form these enzymes. For the next couple of slides, really all of this is going to be reviewing. Looking at carbohydrate metabolism, we have both the anaerobic pathway and the aerobic pathway. So anaerobic, this is without oxygen, and aerobic, this is in the presence of oxygen. So here's that note again. So we don't use oxygen, and here we use oxygen. And remember, if we use oxygen, do we have more ATP or less ATP than if we don't use oxygen? Correct. We have more ATP generated in the presence of oxygen and breaking down all this glucose. Okay, so we had 32 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose versus 2 molecules of ATP and lactic acid in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so really why we're breaking down carbohydrates? Well, we need that as an energy source to power functions of our cells. So as a review of cellular respiration, what exactly goes on? You take glucose, you add oxygen to that, you form carbon dioxide, water, and all of this energy. And really the formation from going from glucose all the way to energy occurs under 3 phases. So we have glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Phase 1 is going to be glycolysis, and glycolysis, really this occurs whether or not you have oxygen. So occurs in the presence or absence of oxygen. And because of that, this is both for aerobic and anaerobic respiration. And so during this phase, you're going to take glucose, and this is going to get broken down into pyruvic acid. So here's that pyruvic acid, and form 2 molecules of ATP. And all of this occurs where in the cell? You remember? In that cytoplasm. Okay, so this is why we don't need oxygen just yet. Okay, we're not entering into our mitochondria. So all this is within our cytoplasm. Now, second phase that we have in cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle. So this pyruvic acid that we just formed is going to enter into our mitochondria, and then this is going to undergo a couple of cycles to form some byproducts, which we're not going to get into. But basically what you end up with is a lot of carbon dioxide, 2 more molecules of ATP, and some byproducts of that are going to enter into our last phase of cellular respiration. All right, so far, and end products enter into our third phase, which is our electron transport chain. Electron transport. Okay, so all right. So here we have phase 3 of cellular respiration, and so that end product that we just got from our Krebs cycle, that's going to enter here, or it's actually going to stay here within our mitochondria. And electron transport chain, really what happens during this phase is we're going to take all of that ADP that we've used already, we're going to combine it with another phosphate to regenerate this into forming another ATP molecule. Okay, so really with the electron transport chain, take ADP, you're going to add another phosphate, you're going to form ATP. And all in all, you're going to form 28 ATP molecules. So really at the end of cellular respiration, how many ATP do we have again? 32. So 28 plus 2 plus 2. So 32 ATP at end of cellular respiration. Okay. Also, you have lots of that water coming out. Formation is a byproduct as well. All right. So really, from these 3 slides, just know the 3 phases, how much ATP is generated, and also the location for each of these phases. All right. Where is it going on within the cell? Okay. So why do we care about glucose? Is because we just went over it. That's how we generate all the energy, a lot of that energy for our cells. And because glucose is the quickest, fastest way for us to get that ATP. We're really concerned about our levels of glucose. So we have different terms given to the different levels. We have hyperglycemia. So hyper means high or excessive. So this is if you have high levels of glucose within your blood. And so if we do have a lot, so usually after a meal you have lots of that glucose, you can store it in your cells in the form of glycogen. And of course, if you have too much, we store it as fat. Hypoglycemia, this means below, so this is below levels of sugar. So here we have polysaccharides, many chain sugars, disaccharides, those are two chains of sugars composed of your monosaccharides, and those are single sugars. So polysaccharides, disaccharides, we're going to undergo digestion, small intestines, and our oral cavity to form these monosaccharides. They're going to get absorbed into our capillary beds in our villi. We're going to store that as fat if it's in excess, or we're going to store it as glycogen. And we can also harness it and use it to form all of this ATP. Now, fat. How is fat handled? Well, a lot of that's formed and handled by our liver, and we use some of that to make this ATP. So in the event that we don't have a lot of this carbohydrates, fat itself can also be converted into a product that enters into our Krebs cycle, and in that we can also generate some energy. So here our fat, once again, composed of glycerol, 3 fatty acids. We're going to bring that towards our liver, break that down. We can use that for our myelin sheath. So what was our myelin sheath used for again? What type of cell? Yep, that's right. So our neurons. So cushioning our neurons, our Schwann cells, those oligodendrocytes forming all that cushion. Fats also function as a fuel in other cells as well. So we can convert that into that energy source. We can break it down to acetic acid, and it's going to enter as acetic acid into our Krebs cycle, and which is once again in our mitochondria. And then from here, all of this can get broken down, enter into our electron transport chain, and then produce ATP. All right. Proteins, how are these used? So once here we have the long chains of our proteins. We're going to break those down into amino acids. We need these for our enzymes, antibodies, our red blood cells, all those connective tissues, muscles, everything, pretty much every single chapter we've looked at, we need that protein. Okay, so here this protein is going to enter into our Krebs cycle, and then from our Krebs cycle it can enter into electron transport chain and then produce some ATP. Now in reality, all of this is going to undergo more extensive and in-depth processes, which we are not going to cover in this class, and which is why I'm not really going into depth into it too much right now. But if you take Zoology 240, 241, you definitely will learn all of that. Okay, liver. So this liver we just looked at, it's really much going to collect all of these nutrients that we just absorbed from our small intestines. And because of that, this liver, it has a huge role in being able to break down or produce all that cholesterol, so all the cholesterol that we're bringing in, being able to store all that extra glucose if we need it, but also break down glycogen and release it into the blood in the event that we don't have enough glucose. We also can screen a lot of these toxins before we send it off to the rest of our blood. So we can detoxify those drugs, the alcohols. And what's interesting about the liver is that it can regenerate a part of itself if it's damaged or removed. And as I mentioned before, just like our spleen, so our spleen can expel all of its blood in case if your blood volume decreases. Same thing with your liver. Your liver can also expel all of its blood to increase your blood volume in case of an emergency. So let's look at these glucose levels, because we just mentioned it controls the glucose homeostasis. So like glycogenesis, this is when we convert, it's the whole entire process of forming glucose into glycogen. So lots of glucose in our body, we're going to store it as glycogen, and that's through glycogenesis. Now, what if we don't don't have enough glucose within our body, and how can we form glucose? Well, we can get glucose from those other nutrient sources that we absorb. So we can produce glucose from fats and proteins, and that's called gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis, this is going to produce glucose from a non-glucose source. Now, in the event that we have not a lot of glucose in our body, well, how do we then break down all this glycogen that we just formed, and then after we break it down and release it into our body? So that's the process of glycogenolysis. Lysis, anytime you lyse something, you're breaking it open or you're splitting something apart. So glycogenolysis, it's a process of breaking down and splitting your glucose. So we're breaking down all this glycogen stores to release our glucose. And as a review of how this all works, if you have lots of glucose within your blood, you're going to start converting all of this glucose into glycogen and store it within your liver. Or if there's excessive amounts, we're going to store it as fat. And this process is called glycogenesis. And here, if we have a decrease in blood levels, we can do two things. We can convert glycogen into glucose, so all that glycogen we just stored through the process of glycogenolysis. Or we can convert amino acids and fats into glucose through gluconeogenesis. And think about this, your new, form, genesis, to generate. So you're forming glucose, so it's a new form of glucose that you're generating. So it's using a non-glucose precursor. Okay, let's see now. What other functions do we have in our liver? So we mentioned earlier, liver, it produces our cholesterol. So 85% of our cholesterol is produced by our liver. And 15% is not. Okay, so this is from our diet sources. We also need that cholesterol for our steroid hormones, our vitamin D. Vitamin D for our bones, right? We need all for that. And of course, we need this to help bring energy for our liver cells, so we can break down fats and fatty acids for energy for our liver cells. Alright, so we just looked at all the metabolic processes and functions, organs involved in that. And now let's take a look at body energy balance. So really taking in all of this ATP, what are we going to do with it? So energy intake, this is a total amount. So if you look at energy balance, you want to look at energy intake and your total energy output. So energy intake, this is how much food energy that's released as your food is being broken down. So all of that, the process of glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, this is our energy that we generate and gain from this entire process, so the 32 molecules of ATP that we formed. Energy output is the amount of energy that we use to exert, that our body exerts to carry out the normal function. So you breathing right now, you're causing your diaphragm to contract. You're using ATP to cause those muscles to contract, those actin and myosin. For me talking right now, I'm also exerting energy. I'm using all those muscles to contract my mouth. You sitting there listening to a lecture, you're using energy to keep your mind awake, hopefully engaged and focused, taking notes. Your eyes are moving side to side. So all those actions are going to use energy. You need all that ATP. So your total body energy balance is this difference between energy intake and your energy output. Okay, so if you look at your body weight is normally stable, but how can we change your body weight? Well, a couple of factors. We have the amount of nutrients you have in your blood. So if you don't have a lot of nutrients, and you can start breaking down other tissues and cells within your body in order to free up some of those nutrients that you need. Hormones. So think about your thyroid hormone. So this plays a huge role in metabolism. If you have high metabolism, then you're going to break down more food. You're going to need more food, and that can also increase your amount of energy intake and output. Body temperature. What's interesting, so if you have a high body temperature, well, your body is going to take the necessary steps to cool it down, so you're going to cause vasodilation. But if your body temperature is low, then you also need more energy, because then you need to shiver, right? So you contract all those muscles to generate that body heat. And then we have psychological factors as well. So one thing was that stress. If you're really stressed, that can affect your eating habits, and also your food storage and intake. Looking at basic metabolic rate. So this is the amount of heat produced by the body per unit time at rest. So when you sleep, you can think about it as your normal function. So your heart is contracting, your breathing, your digestive organs may be at rest, but at the same time, you're still contracting all those smooth muscles in your arteries and your veins, right? So you have a lot of things going on in your body. So all of this is going to generate heat when you use that ATP. Remember, you release heat in the process. Your average BMR is going to be 60 to 72 kilocalories per hour. And what is kcal? So kilocalories is what we use to measure all this energy of food and by our body. I'm sorry, not just food, but also what we use to exert our energy. What can influence our basic metabolic rate is surface area. And what's interesting is smaller bodies usually have a higher basic metabolic rate. So babies have higher BMR than an adult. Gender, males have higher BMRs. Children and adolescents also have high BMRs. And think about why that is. Well, they're constantly growing, their cells are growing and dividing, and so because of that, they are also going to exert and use more ATP. And then, of course, is thyroxine. So thyroxine to produce that thyroid hormone for metabolism. Okay. So TMR, this is total metabolic rate. And so this is the amount of kilocalories the body must consume to fuel ongoing activities. So this is BMR at rest. This is just how much we need. But TMR is how much we need to actually continue to live and thrive. If we increase your body activity, of course, you're also going to need more energy, right? So you need more calories into your body. And so if you consume, let's say you work out for, 2 hours, you lose like 500 kilocalories, but at the same time, right after, you're like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to go to McDonald's, I'm going to get a Big Mac, milkshake, French fries. Well, you've consumed way more calories than the amount of calories that you burned off. And so what's going to happen eventually is, while you have burned off that calories, really you've eaten more calories that you needed. So what happens to that? It gets stored as fat. So if you maintain amount of calories you consume and calories you burn off, then you'll have homeostasis. So your total metabolic rate is going to be it's going to be unchanging. But if you, let's say, work out a lot, you change your diet, you consume less calories, then that's how you can start losing weight. But remember, you want to be healthy about it. And so really, what's a good idea is think about things that take a long time to process, to digest. Proteins take a long time to digest and break down. So if you're thinking about wanting to lose weight, think about high protein, and also thinking about what can actually make you full. Look at lettuce, like salads, vegetables. Those are bulky items that have little calories, and not only that, they're nutritious. High minerals, high vitamins are good for your body. It's going to take longer for you to digest, and a lot of it is going to end up getting rid as waste because we don't break down a lot of that cellulose. But at the same time, because they're bulky, it's going to take a lot longer for you to feel hungry again because it's still breaking it down. First is something like chips. Next time, I want you to think about when you get really hungry. I know some of you reach for a bag of potato chips, but look at how much grams of fat that is. On average, you have 9 to 15 grams of fat for one bag of chips. Versus you get a whole bowl of salad for like 5 grams of fat. That salad's going to hold you off longer than that bag of chips. So just kind of things to be mindful about if you want to start losing weight. But of course, also, as mentioned before, you also want to have a well-balanced diet. So don't forget about your carbohydrates as well. And you can treat yourself. You can also have that ice cream cone once in a while. Okay. So last thing we have is body temperature regulation. And so every time we break down all this ATP, we're also releasing energy in the form of heat. And so we need to be able to regulate all of this heat that's being released, and that's all done by our hypothalamus. And so how do we control this? This is also a quick review. So anytime your body temperature increases, hypothalamus detects this, we're going to cause increased vasodilation, so of our vessels, and also we're going to have our sweat glands activated so we can start sweating and cool off at the same time. This will help decrease our total body temperature. Now, if our body temperature decreases, it's cold, hypothalamus detects that, we're going to have vasoconstriction, so we don't want our vessels to dilate, and we're also going to have our muscles contract because we can start releasing heat to warm up our body. This is going to increase our body temperature. And so this is the end of chapter 14, and I'll see you in chapter 15.